Thank you so much, Linda, for that very nice and nice introduction. And it is indeed a pleasure to be back here in Wisconsin, even though it is quite cold. So all of my winter blood from Madison has worn off. My years in New Orleans and then in Virginia have not been conducive to keeping it. But it is good to be back here and to see you all, and I am just thrilled to be here. So, why am I here? So I want to start out with, what it is that kind of brings me to classical education. Just tell you a little bit about it. So I managed to get through 3 degrees without reading much of the classics. And that is for another conversation about higher education these days. But I was blessed to then get a classical education when I started homeschooling my daughters. So I homeschooled them for 13 years and then just stopped 2 years ago when we moved to Virginia. Now they're in a classical and Christian school. But it was in classically educating them that I got my own classical education. And so my first introduction to Homer was a children's picture book that I read with my daughters. The children's illustrated version of the Odyssey by Joanne Cross. And so then every few years we would read a more sophisticated versions of Homer and Shakespeare and so on. And then of course I always integrated diverse groups of writers into that as well. And so that was where my journey started. At the time we were living in New Orleans, and I was living in a majority Black, mainly low-income, working-class neighborhood. And my neighbors would ask me, we are struggling. Our children are struggling in school. We're not kind of sure what to do. We know you're an educator. Is there anything you might be able to do to help us? And so I and another Black homeschooling mother co-founded Beyond Saw Classical Community, which brings classical education to communities that otherwise would not usually get it, and does it in a way where we weave together different cultural traditions, and so it makes it a very kind of winsome program for the kids. So for 6 years, I ran it as an after-school program in my neighborhood in New Orleans, and then when the pandemic shifted things and shut things down, we shifted to writing formal curricula, lower school and upper school, that can be used to replicate what we were doing in New Orleans. So there are a few different programs now that are using it in different parts of the country, one in Uganda, and we are trying to get more partners to use it. So as I'm talking, I'm actually going to pass around a couple of things from the program, from our children, just for your perusal. So this first one is a drawing from a young student who is in one of our programs this year, who is in a foster care program that is using our curriculum. And so this is a drawing that he did. And I invite you to kind of take a look and see if you have a sense of what is going on in this drawing. And then I can kind of tell you at the end what's happening there. And then these are some of my favorite things. So this is a booklet that we created in the after-school program when we were going through Greek mythology in New Orleans. And so the children wrote haiku poems based on Greek mythology. My college students would do service learning with me in the community, and so they would sit down one-on-one with them. I had a college student who was very gifted, or is a very gifted artist and graphic designer, who did all of the design and all of the art in here. So I asked her to imaginatively recreate the Greek gods and goddesses from different kinds of cultural backgrounds, and she came up with some really fun things, and it really delighted our students. So I will pass these around for you. We had a local diner owner buy 100 copies of that and invite our children for lunch, and then she gave the booklets away to her customers and had our children sign the booklets. And it was the best thing you could ever imagine. They were thrilled. They felt like celebrities, This was their work. They had done this work. There's a line of adults waiting for them to sign their poetry books. It was just the most wonderful thing. So that's why I do this kind of work, because I just really, really believe in classical education for everyone, absolutely everyone. I also think that classical education can help us with some of the great tensions that we're dealing with in our society right now. So much political polarization, so many kind of resurrections of various kinds of culture wars, and I believe that classical education has a lot to offer to try to bring us together, which may seem counterproductive because, especially lately in the news, classical education has been portrayed as something that is not that. That is the opposite of that. That is trying to bring, more of one kind of point of view that's dominating and that's exclusive and so on. And so part of what I want to talk about today is why I don't think that that has to be the way it is, and the resources that I see in classical education for really actually helping to bring us together in all of the multifaceted aspects of who we are as a community. All right, so the topic is the American Project, Voices in Dialogue. And as you'll see, what I try to do is to kind of make this dialogue between different kinds of authors to help us work through some of these difficult problems. So we have this big question that's been coming up more and more. What should our posture be toward complicated, difficult aspects of the American past? This has been a very, very big and thorny question, especially over the last few years. And what value is there in studying primary documents and classic text as we're doing this? The American Project, who are we as Americans? And is the American Project fundamentally good or fundamentally flawed? These have been some of the questions that are at the center of what we're dealing with. So we've been in this cultural tug of war. I'm sure you all have been reading up on it, right? So the 1619 Project that came out in 2019 begins with, our democracy's founding ideals were false when they were written. Black Americans have fought to make them true. The United States is a nation founded on both an ideal and a lie. It's gotten a lot of fiery discussion going, right? One of the responses, the 1776 report, which says, in the course of human events, there have always been those who deny or reject human freedom, but Americans will never falter in defending the fundamental truths of human liberty proclaimed on July 4th, 1776. We must always hold these truths. So there's been this kind of cultural tug and war back and forth between what seem to be these very polarized approaches to thinking about the American Project and the past. So I think in order to kind of move forward with, well, what role does classical education have in helping us to have these conversations in a more fruitful way, we first want to kind of back up and think about what are we about in classical education? What is it that we're trying to do? What kinds of graduates are we trying to shape? And I think that these three aspects are some of the things that we want. We want to cultivate a sense of wonder in our children. We want them to pursue truth, goodness, and beauty. And we want them to cultivate the flourishing of not only themselves, but also of others, of the larger society around them, right? And so what we're trying to do is, not to kind of win any particular ideological wars, or, have a particular limited view of the past, but we want this wonder, we want this truth, goodness, and beauty, and we want this flourishing of self and others. And so we want the kind of education that's going to allow us to do that. So I think that we can cultivate all of those things in our thinking about the past as we do work in history. And so as Linda was saying, the kind of scholarship I do, I'm in the sociology department, but all of my work is profoundly historical. I do a lot of work on the 18th and 19th century. Trying to think about what's unique about my work compared to kind of a mainstream historian is whereas a historian would probably take maybe, 50 years or so in the 18th century or the 19th century, go very, very deep in that one period. What I tend to do, my first book goes over 200 years of history, and the one I'm working on now goes over 300 years of history. And so I am trying to understand how the past has affected the present. And so I gather data from the past, but then I also do interviews in the present, and I'm trying to see how we can make the two talk to each other. And so that's what makes my work as a sociologist distinct from that of a historian. I'm always thinking about how do we have this dialogue with the past, because we have very short memories, and we don't usually remember that we've already been down this road. So as I've been listening to all of this back and forth, especially since 2019, I said, I feel like deja vu. But I don't think everyone everyone knows that because we don't know this history, right? And so I see that while history doesn't repeat itself, it does rhyme or echo with the past. And so I'm going to take you through some of the parallels of the past in today's discussions. And I think this is important because people who've been through this, great writers, and this is the beauty of classic text and founding documents, they were so much more articulate and thoughtful about this, and they're so much smarter than I am. And so I feel like, why not take advantage of that? We've already been over this ground with people who thought this through much more carefully than we have today, and they didn't have the barrier or the obstacle of social media, which tends to inflame things, boil things down to tweets, and so on. They were able to be thoughtful, to really kind of dwell with these thorny questions. So the study of primary documents and classic texts provides a foundation for us to think about the past, and the study of great lives provides images of virtue for us and our students to emulate. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples of how this works out. One of the things that classical education is often accused of is, well, you just want to kind of wash over anything that was bad or difficult in the past and only promote all that is good. Well, we do want to promote what is good, but that doesn't mean we can't talk about the difficulties of the past, but how do we talk about those difficulties? There are various ways of talking about it that may be more or less fruitful. And so what I'm going to be presenting to you are some of those controversies of the past, the way that people in the 18th and 19th century actually lived through them. Right? And what were some of the voices? What were some of the questions? How did they work through them? And I use the Black intellectual tradition to do that because there are so many great Black writers who are very thoughtful about all of these questions of who we are as Americans. So Phillis Wheatley is chief among these in my book. She was there at the Revolution, maybe not on the battlefield, but she was there in the Revolutionary period and very much in all of these debates. And she often gets forgotten. I've given talks on her, and I've had many people say, "Wow, I didn't know very much about Phillis Wheatley, or I hadn't heard of her," but she is an extraordinary person. So who was Phillis Wheatley? So the backstory is that Timothy Fitch was a wealthy Boston merchant, and he ordered one of his agents to go on this trip to West Africa. It's a slaving trip. And he said, I'm going to send you to Senegal. I want you to come back with lots of men who are very strong, who can work. And when the agent got back, he said, "This is a very disappointing venture. You brought back a lot of women and sickly girls. This is not what I had in mind." One of those sickly girls was Phillis Wheatley. We think that she was about 7 years old because she was missing her front 2 teeth. And that is, for those of you who have never had children, that is about the age 7 years old. I can't even begin to imagine the horror for a 7-year-old girl on a slave ship. I mean, it's horrible for anyone. It's not like you have a latrine that you go to. Right? People are literally packed in like sardines. Sickness, death, horror, rape, any horrible thing you can imagine. So this 7-year-old child. She was not terribly well when she got there to the Wheatleys. So why would the Wheatleys have been interested in this sickly 7-year-old child? So there are various theories. The Wheatleys had lost 3 children by the time the ship was called the Phillis, actually. That's why she was named after the slave ship she came over on. So by the time the slave ship, the Phillis, got there, they had lost 3 children. One of them was a little girl that was about the same age as Phillis when she died. And so one of the ideas is that Susanna Wheatley, the wife of John Wheatley, may have thought, looking at this little girl, this reminds me of the daughter that I just lost. So they brought her home. They were pretty wealthy because there was no other reason. They were not going to get any quote-unquote economic value out of her. And so she was considered a quote-unquote luxury good no particular reason to have her, and so it may have just been kind of sentimental reasons. So they bring her back to their house. They have twins who are teenagers, and they see very quickly that Phillis Wheatley is pretty smart. To their credit, they educate her. Okay, so many people did not educate enslaved people, and many women did not get even the kind of education that Phillis Wheatley got. So I make reference to this really interesting book called Liberty's Daughters in my book, where Mary Beth Norton estimates, quote, only about half the white American female population in the 18th century may have been sufficiently literate to sign a name to a will. So even compared to white women, Phillis Wheatley got a superior education. So she was educated in Latin, she was highly literate and well-read, she had access to the Wheatley's library, she got the lessons that the teens got in the Wheatley household. A memoir from the time says that Phillis Wheatley was integrated mainly into the family, so she was treated unlike enslaved people are usually treated. So we don't necessarily want to get the picture like this was the standard treatment. This was highly unusual. But it is a very good thing that they invested so well in her. She is living at the time of the American Revolution just down the street from the Boston Massacre. So she's living on the corner a few blocks away. So she is very intimately aware of all that is going on with the revolution. You know, of course, in her home, this would have been the top. John Wheatley was a very prominent tailor, and John Hancock was one of his customers. So you get the sense of how looped in this family was to all of what was going on with the revolution. And I like to really emphasize that African Americans had a choice during this time. That is, they could make a decision, were they for the revolution or not, especially because the British, in order to try to get the upper hand, were offering to those who would come to their side freedom, right? You come fight for us, you know, you can get out of this bondage that you're in under the Americans. And so African Americans, now it's another thing as to whether or not they kept that promise, but that was what was offered. So African Americans had to make a choice, and Phillis made a choice. She could have just said nothing, right? You know, she's a young enslaved woman. Why get into somebody, you know, this is your fight. She didn't have to do anything, but she made a conscious choice. And I think she also made a choice because she identified with the goals of the revolution for freedom with herself and her people. And I think you'll see this in her poetry. She said, oh, this is a fight about freedom, I want in. You know, not only for the colonies, but for me and for my people. Freedom is something that I can get behind. So there was a young man named Mr. Snyder who was killed before the Boston Massacre. And she wrote a poem on him, and she saw him as one of the first casualties of the revolution, because there were a lot of skirmishes going on with the British at the time. And so she writes this kind of ode to Mr. Snyder, who was killed during one of these scuffles. In heaven's eternal court, it was decreed, thou, the first martyr for the common good, long hid before a vile infernal fear prevents Achilles in his mid-career. Where'er this fury darts his poisonous breath, all are endangered to the shafts of death. The generous sires beheld the fatal wound, saw their young champion gasping on the ground. So she is thinking about these issues. She is trying to immortalize them in her poetry. She was a very accomplished poet, but she had not published a book, and she wanted to publish a book. And publishing tends to be difficult at any time. It was difficult at this time, it's difficult now. At this time, you had to kind of get a group of sponsors together to say, yes, we're behind this book, financially, we're gonna buy this book. So she had tried in May 1772 to get a book of her poetry published in Boston, and she was not successful. She wasn't able to get enough sponsors together. About the same time, the Earl of Dartmouth was appointed Secretary of State for the colonies. So Dartmouth is in England. He's appointed as the Secretary of State for the colonies. And interestingly, at the same time, one of his agents, Thomas Woolridge, was touring New England at the time that Dartmouth was appointed. And Woolridge said, I've heard about this Phillis Wheatley. She seems to be some kind of phenomenon, this African writer of poetry. And so he decided to stop by and pay her a visit. It's like, is this real? Is someone else writing these poems? What's going on? So he goes over, he pays a visit to Phillis, and he says, I want to see you write a poem. And I'm going to give you the topic. So I want you to write a poem on the Earl of Dartmouth. And he says, okay. All right, I can do that. Come here in the morning, you will have your poem on Dartmouth. And she engaged him in conversation. She knew all about Dartmouth, his political appointment, what he was doing, that he was going to be the Secretary of State for the colonies. She was politically very well informed. And in fact, on the eventual publication of her book, she was interrogated, basically, by a group of leading Bostonian men who also didn't believe she wrote the poems and who, verbally interrogated her on the poetry, on, the Latin and Greek allusions. Did she really know what she was talking about? They were satisfied by the end of that. Okay, so now it's Thomas Woolridge's turn to say, well, let's see if this is right. So here's what he says in his letter back to Dartmouth. While in Boston, I heard of a very extraordinary female slave who had made some verses on our mutually dear deceased friend. I visited her mistress and found by conversing with the African that she was no impostor. I asked if she could write on any subject. She said, yes, we had just heard of your lordship's appointment. I gave your name, which she was well acquainted with. She immediately wrote a rough copy of the enclosed poem, address and letter which I promised to convey or deliver. I was astonished and could hardly believe my own eyes. I was present while she wrote and can attest that it is her very own production. She showed me her letter to Lady Huntingdon, which I dare say your lordship has seen. I send you an account signed by her master of her importation education, and they all wrote in her hand. Pardon the account I have given you of this poor untutored slave, when possibly your precious time may be very ill bestowed in reading my scrawls. So, yes, he got to see the beginning process of her writing this poem. He got to engage her in conversation. She finishes the poem, he comes back the next day, he gets the letter and the poem, and he conveys them to Dartmouth. So later on in 1773, she actually gets a trip to England. She arrives in London in June 1773. She meets the Countess of Huntingdon, who becomes one of her patrons to help her get this published. And the Earl of Dartmouth is also very supportive. And so while she couldn't get the volume of poetry published in Boston, she got it published in England. She was very politically savvy because what you see is that the poems that she was going to have published in Boston, she leaves some of them out when she gets them published in England because they are in support of the Revolutionary cause. Right? So she's like, I might want to take that one out. So she was a very, very smart young woman. And she was still under the age of 20. She had done all of this extraordinary work. She got all of these patrons in England. So here is, before she actually met Dartmouth, here are some excerpts from this poem. And here she is very careful. So she's praising Dartmouth. Again, the political savvy is quite extraordinary. She's praising Dartmouth while she is also making a plea for freedom for Black people. So she says, hail happy day when smiling like the morn, fair freedom rose New England to adorn. The northern pine beneath her genial ray, Dartmouth congratulates thy blissful sway. So she is greeting him first by saying, freedom is coming. And at your appointment now as Secretary of Colonies, I am so sure you will be promoting the cause of freedom here, right? Elate with hope her race no longer mourns, each soul expands, each grateful bosom burns, while in thy hand with pleasure we behold behold, the silken reins and freedom's charms unfold, long lost to realms beneath the northern skies. So she refers to his upcoming rule as silken reins, right? So you're not going to come and put, a terrible hard bit in our mouths and, kind of whip us into shape. These are going to be silken reins. You're going to govern in a way that's fair and that's good and that's conducive to freedom. Should you, my lord, while you peruse my song, wonder from whence my love of freedom sprung, whence flow these wishes for the common good, by feeling hearts alone best understood, I, young in life, by seeming cruel fate, was snatched from Afric's fancied happy seat. What pangs excruciating must molest, what sorrows labor in my parents' breast. So she's making this linkage between freedom for the colonists and freedom for her people. She's saying, if you wonder why I care so much about freedom, it's because I was snatched from my parents in Africa and brought here and enslaved. Right? So she is not shy about that, about criticizing slavery. And here's where I just want to make a note about a very unfortunate thing that has happened to Phillis Wheatley, which is that one of her shortest poems on being brought from Africa to America is the most anthologized poem of Phillis Wheatley. And that poem, I think it's maybe 7 lines or so, which may be why it's most anthologized, because her poetry tends to be fairly complex, very laden with classical allusions, and it can be very intimidating. And so I suspect someone 100 years or so ago said, oh, we have this little poem, let's take this one. Unfortunately, that poem is often read as if it is saying she was happy to be kidnapped from Africa and enslaved. And you have to read it within the context, because what she is saying is, hey, now I have been introduced to the gospel and I'm a Christian and I'm very happy that now I know Christ. But in this time period, the understanding was, and Phyllis's understanding was, that everyone would be better off being a Christian, right? It was not a time like today where people are very reticent about talking about what their faith was. The understanding was that anyone who was not a Christian was living in darkness. And so it's more like saying, well, if I had to find a silver lining, at least now I've been introduced to the gospel. But that's not the way it's been read. It's been read as, thank God I got out of that heathen land and now I'm in here enslaved and, with all of my superiors. That is not what she was saying. And if you read her letters, she's even more pointed than she is here about criticizing slavery. So there's no way you could come to that understanding. Unfortunately, if you're just reading that one poem, that's what it sounds like. And so a whole generation of African American scholars consigned her to the dustbin of history and said, she's not one of us, we don't want to be part of her. That is not what we're looking for. Henry Louis Gates, who's a very renowned academic and intellectual at Harvard, has really resuscitated her reputation and done a lot of great scholarship on her. And so we now, and I don't know how many of her poems and letters were available to at the time when this was happening, but I assure you that that is not who she is, the way she's been made to seem. So this is an example more of that I think is more accurate to who she is. She also had a really wonderful letter exchange with George Washington and wrote a poem dedicated to him. So this is an excerpt from the poem to George Washington. Celestial choir enthroned in realms of light, Columbia's scenes of glorious toils I write. Columbia used to be a name for the United States. And Columbia, the figure of Columbia, the goddess, was, she was a contender with the Statue of Liberty for kind of being the representation of America. So at the time it was Columbia. The goddess comes, she moves divinely fair, olive and laurel binds her golden hair. Wherever shines this native of the skies, unnumbered charms and recent graces rise. Muse, thou propitious while my pen relates how pour her armies through 1,000 gates. As when Aeolus heaven's fair face deforms, and wrapped in tempest and the night of storms. So she's writing in support of the revolution and praising General George Washington. Fixed are are the eyes of nations on the scales, for in their hopes Columbia's arm prevails. Anon Britannia droops the pensive head, while round increase the rising hills of dead. Ah, cruel blindness to Columbia's state, lament thy thirst of boundless power too late. Proceed, great chief, with virtue on thy side, thy every action let the goddess guide. A crown, a mansion, and a throne that shine, with gold unfading, Washington be thine. So it's this whole battle between Columbia and Britannia. And Britannia is the female representation of Britain. And she says, too late, Britannia realizes that they should have stopped and that they should have given us our freedom. And now there are rising hills of dead. So she writes this letter and this poem and sends it to Washington. Washington gets it and writes her back. And I won't read through the whole letter, but basically he's highly flattered. He's heard of Phillis Wheatley. He knows of her renown. And he says, I would have had this published, but it would have looked kind of vain if I had it published. But thank you so much. And so he doesn't have it published, but he has a friend have it published. And so it's published in newspapers. People read about how great Washington is, and it is Phillis Wheatley who has written it. So this, I think what you see in Phillis Wheatley in terms of this, this question of what does it mean American, what does it mean to be American, and who are we, she is very critical, right? Where she sees hypocrisy, are we for freedom or are we not for freedom? Like, just certain freedoms, or what's going on here? She's very critical where she needs to be critical, but she's also very supportive of the American project. And the two of those do not have to be in conflict, right? They're part of the same thing. You don't have to say everything about everything we've ever done is awesome. It's not true, right? So the project, the ideals, the aspirations are beautiful, but we can also be honest about where we haven't lived up to that. And I think Phillis Wheatley gives us a good example. Here's another pairing that I'll give you. Alexander Crummell and Frederick Douglass on remembering the past. How do we remember the past, especially when it's a very difficult and controversial past? And they had very different approaches to how to do this, because there is diversity even within the Black community on how to think about these things, right? So Frederick Douglass, an excerpt from his famous speech, What to the Slave is the 4th of July, says, America is false to the past, false to the present, and solemnly binds herself to be false to the future. Alexander Crummell, also a very prominent intellectual of the 19th century, says, the morbid, absorbing, and abiding recollection of slavery, what is it but the continuance of that same condition in memory and dark imagination? So they had different ways of thinking about the recent past of slavery and emancipation, and how should you orient yourself in thinking about these things, because they're very important. So a little background on Alexander Crummell. He is born free in New York City in 1819 and attended the African Free School in the city. So there's a group of African free schools that were founded by John Jay and Alexander Hamilton to educate African students. So they used the term African at the time, not Black. So to educate African students, his mother had been born free. His father had been enslaved but gotten his freedom. So this is really early in the 19th century, right? And his parents even into the 18th century had been free. So you're getting kind of generations of Black people free. His father did not know how to read, but he sent all of his kids to the African free schools so that they got a superior education. He and his family belonged to St. Philip's Episcopal in New York City, which had many elite Black families, and his family was part of the Black elite in the early 19th century. And this is part of also what I think people forget, is that it's not as if all Black people, even in our history, were poor and enslaved. There are generations that have actually been free and highly educated. And I think that's very important, because what can happen otherwise, if the portrayal in our teaching is, oh, well, you've always been enslaved and oppressed, then that sends a certain message, not only to Black students, but to students of all backgrounds. It's like, it almost becomes like that's essentially what you have been all the time, as opposed to, well, there have been different experiences. Yes, the majority experience in the 19th century was enslaved and oppressed, But there have always been other groups, and there have always been Black Americans who were working very much on the cause of freedom and working to bring all of their community up, and who were very educated and fairly well off. So he is educated in Cambridge, again, another very elite background. He eventually takes a pastoral role in Liberia. And so Liberia was part of a colonization effort that was not terribly popular amongst Black people. There were a number of people, and this is another thing that can often get buried, there are a number of founding fathers who did not agree with slavery, even though they had slaves. How is that? That doesn't make sense, right? So in the 18th century, many of the founding fathers, including Jefferson of my University of Virginia, had slaves but felt like this was not something sustainable. And they assumed that slavery would and should die out soon. And they built it in for it to die out, but they did not sell their slaves. And there are a lot of complex reasons for that. But I would say many of them did not think it would continue, but they also did not necessarily think that Black people would or should stay here. So many of them, I thought colonization is better. Okay, so we get rid of slavery and then we send all the Black people to Africa. Well, African American leaders said, think again. We haven't spent generations building this country up in order for you to send us to a place that we have never been. What? We just built you a rich country on our blood and our backs, and then now you want to cut us out of what we have built. And you take all the wealth, and then you send us to Africa. That's not good. So Liberia was one of those colonies. A few people did do that. Alexander Crummell went there as a pastor. He did come back to the United States. So it wasn't something that really took off, I think, for a lot of very good reasons. So in one of his speeches, and apparently Frederick Douglass was at this particular speech, Crummell is talking about the past. Much like we've been having this big debate about the past, how do we think about slavery and oppression and racism in the past? How do we think about the ways to move forward? He says, if men will put themselves in narrow and straightened grooves, if they will morbidly divorce themselves from large ideas and noble convictions, they are sure to bring distress, pettiness, and misery into their being. For the mind of man was made for things grand, exalted, and majestic. And so he's writing in the 19th century, so it's not like slavery is very far behind. He's saying, well, we can't keep dwelling on that past. Then he makes this distinction between memory versus recollection of the difficult past. What I would fain have you guard against is not the memory of slavery, but the constant recollection of it as the commanding thought of a new people, who should be marching on to the broadest freedom of thought in a new and glorious present and a still more magnificent future. So he says, of course there's going to be a memory of it, but don't recollect it in terms of dwelling morbidly on that. So this is Alexander Crummell's perspective on the past. Frederick Douglass has a different perspective. He was in that audience and he said, we are always going to remember. And we'll actively remember. We're not just going to forget. So again, diversity in viewpoints. So who was Douglass? I'm sure you're much more familiar with Douglass than you are with Crummell. He's born into slavery in 1818. When he gets kind of a very big break and turning point in his life, when he's about 10 or so, he is sent to Baltimore. So he had been in the rural areas. He's sent to Baltimore with the Alds, a white couple who are going to have him work in the household and with his son. And Mrs. Auld starts to teach him to learn how to read. She's very sweet. He's really kind of thrown off because she makes eye contact with him. She's very sweet to him. She treats him like a person. She's teaching him how to read. He's like, this is something new. I've never seen anything like this from any other white people. Then Mr. Auld finds out what's going on and says, this is terrible. You can't teach him how to read. He will not be fit to be a slave anymore. And then at that point, she does a total 180. She becomes fierce and mean and, haranguing. And what Douglass writes in his narrative is, well, this thing really actually, slavery is not only bad for Black people, obviously, it's clearly not good for white people either, because this was like the sweetest, gentlest, most generous-hearted woman, and now she's bought into the slave ideology, and it has just crippled her soul. Just crippled her soul. And so he wrote about that this is something that is crippling both Black and white people. But he now understands that the freedom of his mind and reading is going to be key to his liberation. So he gets some of the other boys in the community, many of them white, and he kind of tricks them into helping him to learn how to read. Like, I bet you don't know what that letter does. Well, yes, I do. And then he kind of learns from them, and he buys a copy of the Columbian Orator when he's 12. And the Columbian Orator was used to train little schoolboys in how to read and do oratory, and it had great speeches and writings from Socrates up to the founding fathers. And he got this really beautiful rhetorical education in the classics with that Columbian Orator. It's really quite extraordinary. And it's one of the reasons, again, that I believe that classical education is really for everyone, and especially for the disadvantaged. Especially. Because there's a way in which if your mind is in chains, you are guaranteed to always be in chains, physically and economically and other ways. And so his turning point of learning how to read was the opening of his mind that then put him on a path to freedom in every other dimension in his life. So here is Douglas on memory, different from Cromwell's approach to memory. He says, we are sometimes asked in the name of patriotism to forget the merits of this fearful struggle and to remember with equal admiration those who struck at the nation's life and those who struck to save it, those who fought for slavery and those who fought for liberty and justice. But we are not here to applaud manly courage, save it as it has been displayed in a noble cause. We must never forget that victory to the rebellion meant death to the republic. So this is a speech at Arlington National Seminary on the Civil War. And then he follows up, and he says, fellow citizens, I am not indifferent to the claims of a generous forgetfulness, but whatever else I may forget, I shall never forget the difference between those who fought for liberty and those who fought for slavery, between those who fought to save the republic and those who fought to destroy it. So he has a different approach to the past than Cromwell does. Cromwell says, let's just let bygones be bygones, we need to move forward. And Douglas says, I don't know, I think there are certain things that we need to remember and certain things we need to forget. Excuse me. Okay, so with these examples, I think that gives us some resources for thinking about engaging with the past. And these are the questions that I started out with, right? What should our posture be toward complicated, difficult aspects of the American past? What value is there in studying primary documents and classic texts in doing this? And I hope I've at least started to answer that question a bit with these examples. Who are we as Americans? And is the American project fundamentally good or fundamentally flawed? And I think we're also at least opening up a conversation on this. I think these writers that I've been referring to would say the American project is fundamentally a good project, but it has not been fully realized, right? It's not like the whole project needs to be thrown out, but we do need to come back to it, to renew our approach to it, and to be honest about where it has fallen down in the past and in the present. So, what we want to do in classical education is we want to learn and emulate the best of who we are as individuals and as a people, studying the lives of great men and women while also acknowledging the human struggle between the best and the worst within us. And there are examples from classic literature and from the Black intellectual tradition of how to do this. So in the dialogue, The Phaedrus, Socrates uses this really arresting charioteer metaphor. And he says basically, let's think of the soul as being divided into three parts. One part is a charioteer, and then the two other parts consist of two different horses that have different orientations toward the good life. One of them is this really rebellious horse. The goal of the charioteer is to steer upward toward the heavens where truth, goodness, and beauty are, and to dwell there. But this rebellious horse keeps trying to drag the charioteer back to the baser things on earth and away from truth, goodness, and beauty. The other good horse is trying to work with the charioteer to get up to all of the beauty and truth and goodness. And these are the three parts of our soul. That charioteer is us trying to control these contending forces within ourselves, right? So part of us really wants the good, really wants this. And then there's this other part that keeps dragging us back down. I think of this with my daughters who are 13 and 16, and the cell phone is the bad rebellious horse, right? It keeps trying to drag them down, and I keep trying to pull them up through my various machinations and monitoring software and snatching things away. And it's this continual struggle to have the good horse win and to try to train the soul, the charioteer in their soul to want that higher and to not give more fuel and feed to this horrible horse that keeps dragging them down, right? So we all have that struggle within us. And then Martin Luther King Jr. Similarly has a beautiful speech where he talks about all of these, from all these different references in literature. He says, whenever you set out to build a creative temple, whatever it may be, you must face the fact that there is a tension at the heart of the universe between good and evil. Hinduism refers to this as a struggle between illusion and reality. Platonic philosophy used to refer to it as a tension between body and soul. Zoroastrianism, a religion of old, used to refer to it as a tension between the god of light and the god of darkness. Traditional Judaism and Christianity refer to it as a tension between God and Satan. Whatever you call it, there is a struggle in the universe between good and evil. So we all are dealing with this struggle, right? And so when we study great lives, we have to acknowledge that struggle, right? Jefferson is amazing, really admirable, but also highly flawed, right? It's all at the same time. It doesn't have to be an either-or kind of thing. We also need to fill our children's minds with good things, right? We don't want it filled with junk. One of the best quotations that I can think of is from Augustine's Confessions, where he ties together memory and kind of what it means to be human and human flourishing. What is it that we put into our children's memories that they can dwell on and become more and more beautiful? He says, I rise by degrees unto him who made me, and I come to the fields and spacious palaces of my memory. Where are the treasures of innumerable images? There is stored up those things which the senses have perceived, and whatever else has been committed and laid up, which forgetfulness has not yet swallowed up and buried. When I enter there, I require what I will to be brought forth, and something instantly comes. Others must be longer sought after, which are fetched, as it were, out of some inner receptacle. He goes on, he talks about this, but basically, we have to have ways to put good things into our children's minds and then help them to take them out again and use them at the appropriate time. Otherwise, if they only have junk in there, they only get junk out. Or you put all the good things in, and then they never figure out how to pull them out again, right? And so this is where I come to recommending something like morning time for all of us. So Cindy Rollins, she homeschooled 10 children over a couple of decades. And she always had this morning time where she would read and do art studies and poetry memory and all of these good things with her kids, putting all of these good things into them. This is a book which is a wonderful, wonderful resource. Basically what she's done is she's boiled down these morning times into something that makes it really useful for the average parent. She's got the plans they use for memorizing poetry, memorizing scripture, songs they would sing, things that they would read. I still do a morning time with my daughters now. I used to do it as well for homeschool for all of those 13 years. It used to be more like an hour. Now it's down to about 20 to 30 minutes because I have to do it, squeeze it in before they go to school. But I'm unwilling to give it up because during that morning time, we have such beautiful conversations. We have theological conversations, philosophical conversations. I read literature with them that they're not studying in school. And so I get to kind of have my input
on how they're being formed and shaped. And it's such an important building time of our relationship. I know everyone can't do that in the morning, but even if it's not in the morning, even if it's afternoon time or maybe just time on the weekend, having that relationship in an ongoing way is just such a beautiful way of forming the kids. So if you're interested, this QR code will take you to some resources on how to do commonplace books with your kids. On Fridays, our morning time, we keep commonplace books. And I won't have time to go into all of it, but it's basically a journal. And on Fridays, our practice has been to read from the lives of the saints. And so they will choose a sentence that, kind of gets across a particular virtue, like faith or generosity or courage. They'll write it in their commonplace book. They will assign a theme to it, and then they'll write a reflection on it. And that is part of helping to get into their memory good things, but also giving them a tangible resource to pull it back out again, just as Augustine was talking about. So it's a really good resource. Readings for family time. So these are some readings that I've used over the years. And right now what I'm doing are short stories because our time is so short. We've just finished reading a Flannery O'Connor short story, Revelations, which we had to read over a couple of weeks. It's a fairly long story, but we read it over the course of a couple of weeks. Then I had them at the end of those 2 weeks, okay, let's go back, pull out themes. What are some of the major themes in Revelations? Now you choose some of those that you're going to write in your commonplace book. And you're going to write what is the theme, and you're going to write a reflection on that. And it's worked really well because we have such short amount of time, but there's such really beautiful short stories. So these are not necessarily short stories, but some of it's poetry. The book on the right at the top is Native American stories, folk tales. So depending on the age of the child, you can determine what's best. I also do picture studies. So I have in our binder, our morning time binder, paintings that we can kind of talk through and they can appreciate the paintings. And these are some I picked on the American Project from Jacob Moritz, The American Struggle, where he talks about the building of America. It's got the Revolutionary War, it's got relationships with Native Americans, enslaved people. It is a fairly bloody one, and so you have to kind of decide which ones, or, depending on the age of your children, you want to share with them. But it's a really very beautiful, powerful work, and there's a lot you can do in a good picture study. So here are just some examples from the American Struggle. This one's on Native Americans. There are various panels, and then he usually has a text that goes along with the story, which makes it a wonderful one for kind of revisiting the story. This one's on immigrants, and this one is peace. And that's it. Thank you very much.